Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host Hannah Zuberi and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. You're watching us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused network. You can watch Muslim Network TV 24/7 on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon TV, Roku TV, and Apple TV. The International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 was created to promote greater religious freedom in countries that engage in religious freedom violations and discrimination based on religion. It was also created to advocate for individuals who struggle with religious persecution and are attacked simply for their beliefs. Signed into law by then President Bill Clinton, the act sought to create 3 different entities to support religious freedom around the world. An ambassador at large for international religious freedom within the Department of State, who is the highest ranking US diplomat on international religious freedom and who is tasked with carrying out the provisions of IRFA, which issues an annual report, negotiations with foreign governments to bring greater religious freedom, and the determination of countries of particular concern, CPC, under this act, which entails further actions. It also created a bipartisan United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, designed to provide independent policy, recommendations, and fact-finding, and a special advisor on international religious freedom within the National Security Council. So this act was introduced in March of 1998 in response to Freedom from Religious Persecution Act of 1997. And it gave it an international, a policy structure for the United States government. And the reason why we wanted to have this show centered around the work specifically of the commission that this act created is because there have been many questions in the Muslim community asking, what does this act mean? We've had questions about what is a country of particular concern? Why does it matter? What is tier 1? What is tier 2? And a lot of people who are interested in religious freedom, whether it is for people of their same belief or people of other faiths in their countries where some Muslims may have immigrated from. So this is something that is concerning them, especially as we look at persecution of Muslims where they are minorities across the world. So we're going to be discussing this in detail today. I have with me today my co-host, who will be Zahir Adil. Zahir is the team lead on our Save India project, and he will be helping ask our guests some questions that he's been getting from his advocacy on religious persecution around the world, anti-religious persecution around the world. So when we have to realize that this was created in response to reports of discrimination based on religion all around the world. 2 recent examples of oppression of Muslims, especially Uyghur Muslims facing in East Turkestan, and oppression Muslims face in India, where the national government is, let's say, on a fast path to fascism and pushes for a completely Hindu state. Some of these are our stances, but we'd really like to learn what is USCIRF, as it's commonly known, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and how it works, and so with this, without any further ado, I'd like to invite Nadine Maenza, a noted speaker, writer, and policy expert with more than 2 decades of experience as an advocate for working families and a champion for international religious freedom. She's the founding director of Patriot Voices, where she's expressed her expertise to shape the organization's special emphasis on public policies that help working families. Thank you so much for being here, Nadine. Nadine is a commissioner for international religious freedom, and she was appointed in May 2018 and was elected vice chair in June 2019. Thank you so much for being with us, Nadine.
So glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Nadine, for being on the show, and good to see you again.
It's good to see you again as well.
So, tell me more about your involvement with USCIRF yourself. How did you first hear about it, and how did you get involved with the work?
So I first heard about USCIRF maybe a decade or so ago, and I was particularly involved in the helping advocate for minorities in Iraq, in Syria during when ISIS had attacked, and I at that point in time was involved in this NGO called Hardwired Global, where I ended up serving as the chairman, and we really were a loud voice for those who were being persecuted and for it to be called genocide. So we at that point in time, I started paying attention to USCIRF and reading and downloading their information. So it was a real honor when I was asked by the White House to consider serving as a commissioner in 2018. And I was just reappointed, and it's just been a real honor to be able to watch the organization provide so much good information that we as advocates were able to use, and then now to be able to be a part of what they're doing. So it's really been an honor.
So let's talk a little bit about the actual work of USCIRF. This is something, it's almost a mystery to some people, especially, so we're talking to our audience, many of them who have never heard of this commission, probably didn't know it existed. Maybe the first time they heard about it is when they saw some of the reports that have been published and been distributed by, for example, Justice for All.
Right. So the way that USCIRF, there was a lot of foresight in how we were created. So as you mentioned earlier, in 1998, and the International Religious Freedom Act created the Office of International Religious Freedom at the State Department, but they also created us at the same time, USCIRF. And what we are is an independent bipartisan agency. So we have 9 commissioners, and we are bipartisan. So we're appointed by the president as well as the Republican and Democratic leaders of the House and the Senate. So we find though that there is very little partisan differences between us. We really are. These are not partisan issues, as you know, and so. So what we're assessed to do is to independently, mandated to do, I should say, is to independently assess religious freedom conditions abroad and then make recommendations to the president, the Secretary of State, and to Congress. And so what's so unique about us is we put blinders on to the bilateral relationship with the country. So we don't consider, China, for instance, was at the cover of our first report in 1999, I believe it was. And at that point in time, of course, the U.S., didn't have a negative view of China, and we were trying to bring up already the religious freedom violations we saw them committing. And so now, for instance, a country that is an ally like Turkey will speak out about the violations we see, not paying attention to the relationship we have with that country. So it really gives us the ability to be free to call a spade, to document religious freedom violations. And we know the State Department's a little bit tougher for them. They have to make considerations based on security, based on a lot of different things when they interact with a country, where we don't. We only look at religious freedom. So we have a professional staff, about 20 nonpartisan staff who are, or as if any of you have met our staff, are really the best at these issues. Highly educated, really talented. And so they do a lot of the research and work with us. We also work and with other organizations that we give grants out to do work for us as well. So we really have the best information at our fingertips. And then we also do visits to the countries. Obviously, COVID has changed that. But before COVID, we visited countries. And so the U.S. government would host us, the embassy would host us, but we would also meet with civil society and try to get a picture of what's going on in a country. But sometimes we can even go in our own capacity. We have a kind of a unique, like a member of Congress can also do this. So for instance, I went to Syria in my own capacity because I wanted to see, after the Turkish incursion, I wanted to see the situation with the religious minorities. After I visited Burma in May of last year, I was able to be hosted on the ground by an NGO that helped me in Bangladesh, because the U.S. government didn't host me in Bangladesh. So we also have the ability to go places in our own capacity so that we could further learn about a situation. And then we come back and we write a report each year about the countries that you'd mentioned earlier about CPC designations and the special watch list. So we assess this, and then we go through the information. What we're looking for to designate a country as a country of particular concern, we're looking for systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. So what we're doing is we're gathering all this information, and we're trying to decide which country meets that criteria, and then be able to make a case for it, and then not just a case for it, but also make recommendations to our own government for what they can do to help move that country towards religious freedom.
Hina, you're muted.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So one of the things that these acronyms sometimes throw people off. So CPC, which is something that we're hearing more and more, is a country of particular concern. So how are, under USCIRF's definition, how are those determined, and what is their significance? Like, what is, when something is placed on that list, how does this help the United States fight for international religious freedom? So number one, how are they placed on that list? What is the significance? And then how does this help the United States fight for international religious freedom?
Sure. So the International Religious Freedom Act requires the president, who has delegated this function to the Secretary of State, to designate as a country of particular concern, or a CPC, those countries that commit systematic, ongoing, or egregious violations of religious freedom. So USCIRF what we do is we recommend countries that meet that requirement. So for instance, the State Department might come out with a list, and they have a list right now of 9 countries that they feel meet the CPC threshold that is that systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. We, however, add 5 more countries that we believe should be designated. So we have a little bit of a broader list than the State Department. And so what happens is once the president or the Secretary of State is designated a country as a country of particular concern, it gives them some tools and specific policy options. They're called presidential actions that they can take, like sanctions or some other way that they can sanction a country, they can punish a country for the religious freedom violations. Unfortunately, there are several countries that the United States gives them a waiver every year, like say Saudi Arabia, where they've never had any consequence for their religious freedom violations. So, we at the U.S. Commission have recommended that they stop giving an automatic waiver, and that they come up with some way specific to that country that they can help push that country towards religious freedom, where they will dialogue with that country. And if they can, and obviously, Saudi Arabia is a good example, they're a country that they can dialogue with, and be able to come up with some way to help, that they can incentivize better treatment of religious freedom and religious minorities in their country. And so now there's also a special watch list, and those are countries that meet 2, but not 3 of the systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom tests. And so we have a broader list again of the special watch list countries than the State Department does. And so again, those are made by the Secretary of State.
Zahir, at this point, I'd like to ask you, you've been working with communities, especially the ones that have been are impacted by this designation. So what are some of the questions that you have heard from people who have been impacted and who are from these countries, especially your work is in India. So what are some of the questions that have been asked?
Sure.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, one of the first questions that a lot of Indians ask me, people who are impacted, people who are really worried about their relatives being back home in India, one of the first questions they were very elated, by the way. So thank you again for the recommendations that were made by USCIRF. However, I think there was a lot of misunderstanding because they believed at that time that is the end result of it all. So I guess it would be very nice, it would be helpful if you would explain the process on how it would work for India in particular. Why was it put back on the list of CPC designations, recommended at least at this time? And what would be the process that would be needed to get it designated by the State Department for the benefit of the viewers?
Sure. So, there is some confusion sometimes because we are a U.S. government body. So even the press will sometimes report the U.S. said this when USCIRF has said something. And so there is a little bit, even in the media, sometimes misunderstanding about who we are. While when we made the recommendation that the U.S. Designate India as a country of particular concern, we unfortunately don't have any tools to be able to punish them. And I know people were disappointed by that. But what we do believe, we caused some growing momentum towards the U.S. government to put pressure on them to designate India as a CPC. And the other thing was we were hoping it would also deter India from wanting to continue down this road of religious violations. But unfortunately, since we've made this recommendation, we have not seen them pull back at all. So that has been a disappointment. But but I do know for a fact that the State Department took our recommendations to heart. The White House took them to heart. I do know there have been discussions at pretty high levels in the administration. Just considering all the information that we've presented and others. So I would just recommend that people continue to talk about, share those violations on social media, share stories, contact their member of Congress and make their opinion known so that, the administration will continue to hear about this from others. What we're hoping that they will also consider, there's different tools they have. If they are a country of particular concern, or if they're not, that they could use to also sanction leaders that are the ones overseeing these violations under the Global Magnitsky Act or U.S. Visa bans. And there are other things they can do that could also deter people from being willing to be a part of these violations and these egregious crimes that are being committed against religious minorities.
One of the other questions that often came to me is, what do we do about some of the leaders back in India itself, or some of the BJP's leaders who have been openly saying things which incite violence? Now, in this country, of course, obviously we take free speech as in ways which are almost untouchable. But this is something that's very new to a lot of the people who are here from India, because they say, well, that speech is why my friend was beat up, or that action by this particular leader. So what can we do about it? Or would you have any recommendation on that?
Yeah. So free speech, even in the United States, the one line that it crosses over into being illegal is when it incites violence. So the kind of speech that we're seeing in India, would not meet our free speech criteria. So, we do recommend that the U.S. government consider these sanctioning tools to those individuals. The visa sanctions just mean they can't come to the United States. Their families can't come to the United States. It's not a huge action, but it still is a way to deter and to shame somebody who has made a decision to commit these atrocities, say these things publicly that they know is going to mean the death and the violence towards religious communities. In the Global Magnitsky Act, which is Treasury sanctions that actually go after them financially, is even a harsher way to sanction leaders. But it's an effective way to have some sort of retribution for their actions. So we believe the U.S. government taking these actions would send a message to people in India and all over the world to be careful about going after religious communities and trying to cause violence against them. That the U.S. will take some sort of action because of that.
And I do know that a USCIRF delegation was not allowed by India to enter the country in the past. Do you think there's going to be any change on that in the future, whether or not this designation happens?
Yeah, we really would love the opportunity to come dialogue. We visited so many of the countries that we have recommended designations for, and Saudi Arabia is a good example. For a country of particular concern that we have visited. We visited Burma. We had good dialogue with the governments. We visited a lot of our special watch list countries and had really warm relationships with the government. So, we're willing. They tell us that we're misunderstanding the information. We're not. We are seeing it differently than it is. So we would welcome the invitation to India to be able to come. They can show us the situation. They can explain if they think that we're misunderstanding. They can show us how we're misunderstanding. Let us meet with religious leaders, religious communities, visit different areas. So we do believe that it'd be in the best interest of both countries for us to visit and have this conversation and really dialogue about maybe we can come to some agreements on some changes. But we certainly are rooting for India. We really would love to see things move back into being the pluralistic, really beautiful, multicultural, multi-religious country that it is, and having that part of the country be a draw for tourism and investments. And we know all those things are going to be affected by all this violence. And for those of us who have friends then that love India, really feel saddened by it. So we don't want to be a part of any sort of harm to the country. We really want to incentivize this behavior that's really going to help bring India back to a place where it can really shine again.
Sure. And this is something that I always explain to people. Even if I'm working for, the name of the project is Save India from Fascism. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we work it is because we love India. We don't want it to go down the path of fascism. So in a lot of cases, people believe that we want to punish the country, but that's not so. That's not true in our minds for sure. And I'm glad that you said that it's not true in USCIRF's mind either.
No, we had a very spirited conversations among the 9 commissioners because we wanted to make it very clear that they had crossed a line that had to be called out for religious freedom, but we also didn't want to do any harm. And because there's a strong sense that they've been a wonderful U.S. ally and that it's a wonderful country and that we, wanted to add value. So we took our duties very seriously in making this recommendation, but it is our mandate to call out the truth and the conditions have changed so drastically downward over the past year that we really felt at the end of the day we had to speak out and make this recommendation, and we're hopeful that they're taking it to heart. We haven't seen any changes yet, but we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. So I'm still hopeful that there are some good forces in the government in India that are wanting to see things change in another direction.
Thank you, Nadine. I appreciate that very much. Back to you, Hannah.
Thank you, Zahir, for your questions. And really, these are some of those questions that we really wanted answered so people can understand and take it seriously. Take this as, really look at it as a gift. In advocacy, sometimes you need tools. And this report has been a tool for us to show that. But one thing that you said, that ally, right? Do allies treat commissioners or a commission of an ally country like India has treated this commission? Mm-hmm. And I ask this in all sincerity. If this was an Indian commission or commissioners who were not allowed to enter the United States, or, for example, yesterday I was with Peter Cook, who is the head of the New York Council of Churches, and he was returned from the airport just for being a Christian. They questioned him for 12 hours. They had visas, 12 people, but they were returned. I'm just imagining what an international outroar there would be if there were 9 priests who had come from India and been returned from JFK. When you call someone an ally, why is there such a difference in the action of one ally towards another?
Yeah, this has gotten very complicated. We really would expect a different level of treatment with being an ally, but clearly this is a sensitive subject for the government, and the kind of treatment towards people that disagree with them doesn't reflect well on them. They would be embraced much more warmly by people if they were willing to just dialogue and allow people to visit and say their side of the story. But I know that unfortunately feel like that there are some folks in the government that don't share our values and that are trying to move further away from us. And so, we hope that our actions are shining a light on them and hopefully empowering the folks in the government that want a prosperous and robust India for the citizens.
Okay. Now, another question that there is a tier 1 and a tier 2. What is the difference between the tiers?
Sure. So we've just recently changed our wording. So originally the U.S. government only had one level of country particular concern, And so what we had at that point in time was we made a recommendation of a tier 1 countries, which would be the countries of particular concern recommendations, and then a tier 2 for countries that didn't quite meet the designation of a country of particular concern, but we felt needed to be addressed. And so, but last year, the State Department added a special watch list now to underneath their country of particular concern, and they've moved some countries into that. They have Nigeria, they have Russia in their special watch list. So we now also, so our tier 1 is basically a country of particular concern, and our tier 2 are those countries we recommend to be a special watch list.
And so on the special watch, and people can move up and down these tiers based on their behaviors.
They hadn't in previous years. We found not many countries have moved around. I think our commission has been pretty aggressive at trying to every year relook at each country and make sure that it's in the right place. So we did move a couple of countries this year, and definitely received a lot of interest. For instance, we moved Uzbekistan from a country of particular concern over to the watch list because we found they were making progress towards freer religious freedom conditions, and that they no longer met all 3 of the ongoing egregious systematic tests that we have for the country of particular concern. So we did move them down, and then of course we moved India up. We also moved Sudan down, another country that's been making a lot of changes towards religious freedom, but they're still on the watch list. Both countries have a lot of work to do, but they're at least moving in the right direction.
So what were some of those signs of progress that you saw?
Right. So for Uzbekistan, for instance, they let a lot of religious freedom, religious prisoners out, and made a commitment to allowing a broader practice of faith. We saw them. When I'd been able to visit the country last year, and it was really encouraging to meet so many religious communities tell stories about how while the laws were still pretty strict for registering religious communities, and in past years, they used to raid a lot and try to find how religious communities that weren't meeting the law. And they had stopped raiding completely. I don't think one house of worship had been raided in the entire year. And then we saw them actually change their laws. I'm working on this major law that they're working on now, but change some of it to make the registration. They'd only registered a few churches a year, and they registered several dozen of them. And so we just saw things like that where they clearly were trying to move towards what we say is the international standard. And people sometimes misunderstand that we come in as a U.S. government agency holding countries to a U.S. standard, and we don't, because we know that, when you look at a country, every country's got a different journey, and certainly a country like Uzbekistan, a country like India, a country like Sudan, they all have a different journey towards religious freedom, and we need to give them some space to move at a pace that keeps that is safe for their country, but that also is opening up human rights for their citizens. And so really that international standard, we were able to say, this is what's the international standard for, registering churches, and this is what the international standard is for how you treat religious minority communities, or, for things like that, for the laws, citizenship, things like that. So that's what we kind of look at. And so they clearly at one point were far above in terms of their regulations, but now they really are on par. There's still one major law that we're looking for them to change, but it's been encouraging to see a country with this kind of progress. For me personally, visiting and seeing the progress personally has been really exciting.
So change is possible.
It takes some leaders in a country willing to do hard things and speak up and build consensus in their own government. So you almost always can point back to people in the government, whether in Uzbekistan, they have a really amazing ambassador to the United States who really played a big role in several members in the administration in their country that worked really hard and were open. And they told us, when they needed time or that some things were going to be harder for them to change right away. And we don't expect, that them. We know they have to have a journey that fits their country. I mean, we respect that. We respect the sovereignty, but we know where the international standard is, and we have to report where they land on that international standard because of the mandate we have. So even if we really are rooting for a country, if they still fit the criteria for a country of particular concern or a special watch list country, we have to report them the way that the facts lay out for them. But we always do in all of our reporting, which is something new that we do this will be our second report we've done this, I believe, is where we say if a country's going it's getting better, getting worse, or it's staying the same, so that you can quickly look at one of our reports and immediately assess like the trends going on in a country, because you really do see a lot these trends that seem to be pretty consistent. When a country is moving in one direction, it's really, inertia is a hard thing. It's hard to turn a country around, but it can be done. And certainly with India, we've seen this shifting, a drastic turn downward. But this is a democracy. It could turn the other way, and we're really hoping that will happen.
I often think about, so one question I do think about, do you have counterparts in other countries around the world? Are there commissions like this in other countries? And mm-hmm. Do you often agree with each other, or do you work together?
No, there unfortunately are not independent agencies that are government agencies like ours. I think what we will find sometimes is a human rights organization in a country that has a lot of respect. So a lot of leaders in that country will look to them for advice. And so sometimes they'll play a role in that their recommendations matter and people listen to them and they have a certain level of influence. So we certainly have dialogued with organizations that are influential in countries, but we've had several countries inquire about how USCIRF is set up and make the potential that their country could set up something similar. We have seen in recent years an addition of envoys for religious freedom, which are similar to our ambassador for religious freedom. And that's been really encouraging to see several countries to designate people in that role to be able to go out and to advocate for religious freedom. And so we've dialogued with a lot of those envoys. We found some of their recommendations, even though they're part of the government, they still make recommendations to their own government as well, even though mostly privately. And we're able to share information and dialogue. So we've been able to find different groups that we can work with, but none exactly like us.
And it's interesting with the United States being a secular country, but still having a commission that protects religious freedom. So, Zahir, did you have any, and I wanted to talk about China a little bit.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I don't have any particular questions from what I've heard on the field anymore, but there's a question that's been on my mind. And that is, at this time, we see a special relationship between the US administration and Modi's administration in India. And we've also been seeing let me back up a bit. One of the strangest things with Modi supporters that we see in this country is that they hate majoritarianism in this country. At the same time, they support majoritarianism in India, which in my view is very strange because you have to like for others what you like for yourself, right? Mm-hmm. However, I'm just wondering whether it's a special relationship between the Trump administration and the Modi administration in India that might make it even more difficult for us to see any changes happening in India. If you can comment on that. Please.
Sure. Well, our diplomats are wise enough to know that public condemnation with somebody like Modi is not going to be real effective and received well. So I have no doubt that there has been dialogue behind the scenes between our governments, and that the administration cares deeply about religious freedom. I have every reason to believe that they've communicated that to the Indian government. But I don't think this is the kind of situation where you're going to see the president of the United States speaking out against the president, the prime minister. So I think it's just because of their relationships and the personalities involved, we're not going to see that probably in a public way. But I'm hopeful that there is dialogue going on behind the scenes.
Hina?
Yes, and that leads me to another question, which I have seen sometimes on as public statements are made by government officials in these countries. Is, for example, if there is a church burning, mm-hmm. or there is a lynching, the government will often say that were extreme elements. We don't have any control over it. That wasn't us. How mm-hmm. is that taken into account in these reports? How does USCIRF sift through these incidents and see what is structural and institutionalized in the country versus what is out of the government's control and someone taking things into their own hands?
That's a really good question, and that's a point that we have debated at USCIRF long before I came to the commission. So we at USCIRF, we do hold we do hold countries accountable for what they can change. So we don't expect, for instance, Open Doors is a Christian organization that ranks countries for persecution, and their worst country to be a Christian, according to them, is Afghanistan. And it's really interesting because we don't have Afghanistan, of course, as a country of particular concern, but they don't have control of the country. So you can't hold a country like some of these countries that don't have any control, and there's a lot of going on that's terrible. You can't hold the government necessarily accountable for everything that's happening because they're such a weak government for different reasons. And so we really do we consider that when we're giving a designation. If there's a country, the leadership doesn't have the control and what's happening in that country isn't, for instance, Iraq, we had as a special watch list country, even though ISIS is decimating the religious communities there, because we knew it wasn't. Iraq still has its issues, and they still do belong on the special watch list. They don't meet the criteria for a special country of particular concern, even though ISIS was an entity of particular concern, because they clearly did. So we do a separation there. So we even look at specific acts of violence that way as well. And in India, fortunately, there are a lot of human rights organizations that are reporting information and able to report, like, this happened because of a mob out. This happened because the government looked away, or maybe the government was involved. So I think we get a lot of information that way. We still hold the government accountable, even if they weren't a part of violations against religious communities. If they tolerated that, we consider that almost the same. So if you tolerate or you commit egregious violations, those both meet the criteria that can give you a CPC designation. So some countries look away and let it happen. Other countries are actively involved, but they're both should be held accountable for those violations.
One question that came in from a viewer is that how impactful, like how will this lead to real impactful change? So if, for example, a country is designated, how will this lead, like for some people, seeing that because it's a long road, they might not see the change. Right. In your experience, and you did talk about the shifting of the, people getting taken off the list. And, I've heard you say this before, that we don't want anybody on that list. We want international freedom for everybody. But how have you seen this be impactful? I know you've been really involved with the Yazidi genocide. Can you point out any times in the past where the work of the Commission or of the International Religious Freedom Ambassador has been impactful in stopping mass atrocities or genocide?
Sure. I think that the one thing I see governments, including the U.S. governments, one of the faults is they really will look away for as long as they can, because once they acknowledge that there's a crime taking place and there's a certain responsibility they have to somehow involve themselves in that. So I think it seems to be, we saw that with the Yazidi genocide. USCIRF was the first government body to call it genocide. The U.S. government didn't act quickly with the Yazidi community when it was first reported these horrible atrocities that were happening when they committed, August 3rd, 2014, and went into a village and, separated the men and the women, systematically killed the older men and the women, took the young women, took the young boys as fighters. What they committed there, nothing really happened for a while after that. Those happened. And so I feel like USCIRF, a lot of our job is to force the U.S. government to not look away. Currently Turkey invaded in northeast Syria. And while Turkey and the overall Syrian picture has kind of been looked at as the opposition, they're the guys that are going to stop Assad. But then when they invaded in northeast Syria, they've occupied these strips of land, and they allow their allies and their own troops to commit these atrocities against Yazidis and Christians and other minorities. They include the same sort of things we saw under ISIS, killings, rapes, forced conversions. We're seeing apostasy now. They're being arrested for apostasy, and all these conditions that are really horrible and what we saw, again, is the U.S. government is just not acknowledging those were happening. So for us, a lot of times we're calling out that these atrocities are happening. You can't look away. And in India, even though our recommendation clearly hasn't changed anything on the ground at this moment, but what it's done is it forced the U.S. government to not look away. We can't engage with the Modi government and pretend everything's okay, because it's not, because things are deteriorating for religious communities there that for no fault of their own. And so I think that that's one of the foresight they had in creating us, that we're kind of at the forefront, because like I said earlier, we don't have those political considerations. In fact, we can't even consider those political considerations. We just have to call a spade a spade. So when atrocities are happening, sometimes it's tough to call them out. Like I said, India was a tough one for us because we didn't want to do any harm. So while nothing has changed, I do believe that international community is now very aware of these atrocities. They can't deny them any longer. And at some point in time, there's going to be a cost to the leadership for making these choices. It may not be as soon as we want, but I think momentum is shifting in that direction. So I do think we have an important role to play for that reason. But I know if you're living in one of these countries and you're the one who's dealing with these violations against you in your community, it's got to be hard to see us do these grand gestures that don't really change anything on the ground yet. But we'll keep advocating and keep making recommendations for specific tools that can be done, actions can be taken that we feel like could deter these leaders from continuing, those same kind of actions. I do want to mention that at the U.S. Commission too, we probably, do as much in advocacy, if not more, behind the scenes that people don't see. I mean, I personally was involved in a prisoner negotiation, for instance, in a country this year, that went favorable. So there are a lot of things we do, private letters to administrative officials, specific administrative officials, making a case for one of our recommendations. And, we've been to a lot of the embassies personally with letters from the commission asking the ambassador to take an action, or telling him we're concerned, or her that we're concerned about something that just happened in their country. So we're able to do those kind of things as well. A lot of that we keep private because our real goal at the U.S. Commission is to make real changes, and just to do these public, statements, but to try to change things behind the scenes. We would love to be able to dialogue more with the Indian government, and we've reached out to them. We hope at some point in time that they'd be willing to meet with us, and maybe we could start having those private discussions as well.
You're muted,
I'm getting an echo, so I try to mute myself. So I'm just going to quickly go over some of the recommendations that were made specifically for India, which was designated as a CPC for engaging in and tolerating systematic, ongoing, egregious religious freedom violations as defined by IRFA, and then targeted sanctions on Indian government agencies and officials responsible for severe violations, strengthening the U.S. embassies, consulates, engagement, and religious communities, local officials and police, especially in regions impacted by religiously motivated violence. And then urging, and this was important too, allocating funding to support civil society to create a monitoring and early warning system in partnership with police to challenge hate speech and incitement to violence. So,
right.
And this is, it would be wonderful if this could just become foreign policy, but that's not. And this is something that our viewers need to understand, that there's a process. And now that this has gone to the State Department, and now it's in the hands of Secretary Pompeo, who is making the decision as we speak right now. Anytime in the next week or so, we'll probably, by September 8th or around that time, we're watching the date, he's going to make a determination on these recommendations. And you've made similar, in fact, stronger recommendations on China, especially since there are two acts in Congress currently supporting the Uyghurs and the Tibetan Policy and Support Act of 2019. What other points, and there's expression of concern with the Beijing Winter Olympics.
Right.
When you talk about USCIRF's position on China, I would like to hear what are some of the key elements that you wanted to highlight.
Sure. We of course have to express outrage at the conditions in Xinjiang with the Uyghur, Kazakhs, and other Muslims that are in concentration camps, millions. And I think it recently has received quite a bit of press, but it's still, so many people probably are unaware that these are concentration camps where detainees are being tortured, raped, and other abuses. Nearly 500,000 Muslim children have been separated from their families and placed in boarding schools where they're forced to praise the Communist Party and to speak Mandarin. In addition, local government has deployed more than 1 million Chinese to live in these families and report signs of extremist behavior. So, we're also seeing forced labor in China with this very same community. So sometimes they're graduated from these concentration camps to work in factories. So you have more than 80,000 Uyghur workers we have seen has been transferred to work in other Chinese cities. We understand even companies like Amazon, Nike, and others are directly employing or sourcing suppliers to use Uyghurs. And so, we really are urging, the pass of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that would bar all goods coming from Xinjiang, because it's really at this point in time, you can't trust any goods coming from that region, because it's pretty clear that so many of them are being used with forced labor. And we feel like that the U.S. government needs to determine if Chinese policies meet the legal definition of genocide. So many now these reports are coming out. The Chinese authorities have subjected thousands of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic Muslim women to pregnancy checks and forced IUDs and sterilization upon them. We understand that the birth rate has plummeted to 24% last year. So, genocide, the Genocide Convention states that imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group is also meets the criteria of genocide. So between, all the different ways that the Chinese government is going after the Uyghur community, we do believe that the U.S. government should take a strong stand and call out and determine if it meets the criteria for genocide. But we're also concerned about the persecution we're seeing against Christians and other religious minorities as well in China continues. There was used to be safe for Christians to be in the official churches and not the underground churches, but now even the official churches have been raided and people have lost their rights to attend those, and they're marked if they go and treated differently. So we're definitely seeing really concerning signs, and we recently had on July 22nd, a hearing about the technology surveillance of religion in China. So in the past, they were China, there was a limit to how much they could do because of manpower. But now with technology, they have cameras in churches, and they're using, even facial technology that can identify if somebody's a Uyghur by their bone structure, things like that that's going on. In the Tibetan community, they're doing the same sort of thing. So we are seeing so many things that are concerning us about China. We do believe that obviously the U.S. government, they're taking some actions. And so we've been making recommendations about China for years. And so it is encouraging to see the U.S. government taking those actions. And we hope that they continue, as well as Congress, to hold China accountable for these violations of religious freedom.
Zahir, did you have any questions? I know we're coming down towards the end of the hour, and so any questions from you?
Sure. I have one other question, Nadine.
Sure.
I've been, as far as genocides are concerned, as far as these pogroms are concerned that continue to happen throughout the world, unfortunately, we haven't seen these decrease too much. In fact, in recent years, they've probably gone up.
Right.
What would you like to see as maybe within USCIRF itself that would allow you to catch these happening even sooner and bring it to the attention of the United States government so that we can probably try to stop these before they begin happening?
Right. I wish I had a stronger answer for you, but I do feel like at USCIRF, we've often, even when I've been there or before I was here, that often they have seen the early warning signs that, the early actions, what were things like taking citizenship away in Burma and all the ways that they were dehumanizing. There's no doubt that there was a call to action from USCIRF for the Rohingya in Burma before the genocide happened. And I know that in India, that's part of why we felt so strongly that we had to speak out at that moment, even though, as I said, it was a tough one, because we also saw those same signs that, they'd taken away of citizenship, the dehumanization and all the things that really happen before you get to the point of mass atrocities. So, the problem is the governments I think when governments acknowledge a mass atrocity coming, they feel obligated to have to take a big action, and there's a risk to that. And most governments just are risk averse by nature. And so part of it is getting to the point where governments are willing to take an action, even though it's risky to go after an ally or go after, you know, a country before they've done something and accuse them of about to do something or about to allow something. Those are really big steps, and we as an international community have to embrace. We have to embrace this and say we're willing to do this, even though it's going to be hard. It's the only way to stop mass atrocities. So I think that these kind of conversations where we just continue to talk about it, for those that are watching, I would say, you know, on social media, share stories, talk about these things openly. And that is the only way that we're going to have it so that lawmakers and influencers and people and governments come into these governments with this sense that they're not going to allow mass atrocities, and they're going to do the hard things, because they are hard to stop. And once, as we've seen with the Rohingya, now it's so far. Now what's the answer forward for them? You know, in some respects, it would have been easier to stop it than now trying to figure out what to do with 1 million people that can't go back home. You know, so it's not going to get easier. I think it's the point when these things start coming, we have to do the hard thing. We have to deal with them as we see them and not wait until we're already in the situation of mass atrocity. Although at that point in time, obviously, we can't walk away either. So these are tough problems with they don't have easy answers. But I think the more we discuss them, the more people become aware of the need for us to stay strong and to prioritize these things, then I think we're going to start seeing perhaps governments take quicker actions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nadine. That was wonderful having a conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciated it.
Thank you to both of you for being here today, and for all of you watching. Today is the 3rd anniversary of the mass exodus of our Rohingya brothers and sisters. From all of us at the Burma Task Force of Justice for All, we've been commemorating this all day on Muslim Network TV. You can watch our rally again in the evening and at night. We have prayers for our Muslim brothers and sisters in the Rohingya camps, in Bangladesh, in the IDP camps, and we just you know, we're working as much as we can over here to make sure that no one forgets about our Rohingya brothers and sisters. So assalamu alaikum, and thank you for joining us today.